Hi, and welcome back to Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. And today, as promised, we'll be going through Psalm 1, and we'll be looking at this particular psalm for today. Okay, coming to... before we get to looking at the text, just by way of reminder from our last study on the principles of poetics, we'll just do a little review. And just remember these phrases from the bishop. The correspondence of one verse or line with another I call parallelism. When a proposition is delivered and a second is subjoined to it or drawn under it, equivalent or contrasted with it in sense, or similar to it in the form of grammatical construction, these I call parallel lines, or parallelismus membrorum. So when we go through the psalm and we're looking at the distichs, it's important for us to find out what is the correspondence of the first verset with the following one, or if it's a tristich, we need to discern what the correspondence of these three lines are. And remember, it's a proposition is delivered in line 1, and then when a second one is subjoined to it or drawn under it, equivalent or contrasted with it in sense, this is where we are to determine the correspondence. So the bishop already thought of this. This was, this goes back to the his first volume on Hebrew poetry was in 1753, and his Isaiah commentary could have been, I think, 1775 or somewhere around there. So this is when all this was first developed. So good for the bishop. And moving along, I always like to remind the reader of Futato that his short definition for Hebrew poetry, it's a type of literature that communicates with terse lines, employing parallelism and imagery in high frequency. Can't go wrong with that. And likewise, turning to another one of my favorite quotes is from Norman Gottwald. The fundamental formal feature of canonical poetry is the correspondence of thought in successive half-lines, known as parallelism of members, or parallelismus membrorum. The thought may be repeated, contrasted, advanced, it may be figurative, stair-like, or inverted. Parallelism may be both within lines and between lines. So notice how he has advanced the thought of Robert Loth. He's looking at it as the correspondence of thought in successive half-lines. Very, very important, and I included that in my own definition of poetry. It definitely is it's we're looking at thoughts in successive half-lines. Very, very astute. And moving on here to alter his strategy of intensification is the introduction of the second verset. So he says the simplest strategy of intensification is the introduction of the second verset of one parallel term that's obviously stronger than its counterpart in the first verset. So just remember, I'm just doing this very quickly, that when we're reading any type of poetic text in the Bible, that you need to pay attention to these particular suggestions that these scholars are giving, and he gives again this example out of Psalm 18. For the waves of death washed around me, line A, but in line B, the torrents of the underworld terrified me. So everything becomes intensified in the second line. And that's where, remember, our theological cache is to be found. And moving on to the Harvard prof, Kugel, what he's saying is parallelistic style of the Bible consists not of stringing together clauses that bear some semantic, syntactic, or phonetic resemblance, nor yet the saying of the same thing twice, but of the sequence A, B, in which B is both a continuation of A and yet broken from it by a pause, a typically emphatic seconding style in which parallelism plays an important part, but whose essence is not parallelism, but the seconding sequence. So basically, when we have line A and line B, there's a short pause by that line represented there, and that's cueing up the reader or the listener for what's coming in line B. And so line B is going to be this typically emphatic seconding style that Kugel is reminding us of. In following John Hobbins, it's good to get the big picture of what's going on here, beyond just the versette or distic level, but to look at the whole poem as a whole, in terms of strophe and stanzas, and then the whole poem. So there's structure to Hebrew poetry beyond the distic, and it's important to grasp that understanding. Okay, now coming to Psalm 1, it's important for us to understand that Psalm 1 is Psalm 1 and 2. The first two psalms function as an introduction to the book of Psalms as a whole. So Psalm 1 this is a Torah or wisdom psalm, and it's a wisdom psalm on the contrasting of the two ways, the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked, and that remember that when if you're going to worship God, you must worship Him in spirit and in truth, as Jesus told the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. So that's who God is looking for. Is looking for worshipers who worship Him in spirit and truth, and the function of Psalm 1 would bring us into that particular mindset. Now, what's typical of some of these Torah or wisdom psalms, that Psalm 1 it would be a part of, and you would see also aspects of this in Psalm 19 as well, and other psalms. And they're typified. Bellinger and Murphy have basically given us a list of about 10 different principles that would emanate from a wisdom or Torah psalm, and these are better than sayings, numerical sayings, admonitions, pedagogical and didactic instruction, beatitudes, the contrasting of the two ways, alphabetic compositions, proverbs, antithetical sayings, and intertextuality. And this particular psalm is definitely pedagogical and didactic. It's a beatitude. It begins with Ashrei Ha'ish. It is definitely the contrasting of two ways. The psalm is split in half, verses 1 through 3. Happy is the way of the righteous, and its destruction for the way of the wicked in verses 4 to 6. It is an alphabetic composition of sorts. It's actually an alphabetic acrostic, in that it begins with aleph, and it ends with tav. The very first word is ashrei, and the last word is toved, ending with a tav. The word, that is, toved. And we'll see this. Zenger brings this out. There are proverbial sayings in these wisdom Torah psalms, antithetical sayings, and our particular Psalm 1 has quite a few antithetical portions to it, and as well as intertextuality. And intertextuality is just basically a newer linguistic type word that talks about the use of allusion. So biblical authors will appropriate other biblical authors. They will appropriate the language and then re-signify it for the needs of the writer's community. So it's the reuse of Scripture, not necessarily interpreting it, but borrowing its language. So it's appropriation, resignification. Now, looking at the psalm, there, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Charles Briggs, in his 2-volume commentary on the Psalms, has rightfully looked at the macro structure of Psalm 1, and he entitled it, it's a psalm of the two ways. So verses 1 to 3, the happy way of the righteous and the disastrous way of the wicked, in verses 4 to 6. That would be your macro structure, and that's how we should approach it. Structure becomes very important when you're beginning to meditate on Scripture, or paragraphs, or units. And this is a very small psalm. It's just six verses. So this is something, as you begin to meditate, you're going to be able to see every single individual unit of these 6 verses. And it's just, when you understand how the whole thing is made, it's just pure mastery by the author, and obviously by inspiration from God. And coming to the psalm, I noted that Eric Zenger had made some very very good comments that some of the American commentaries, at least the ones that I saw, didn't bring out. And here he's basically saying Psalm 1 is shaped in the language and imagery from wisdom, as I guess as a life teaching, or a doctrine of life, and as such, it wishes to offer an A to Z. All right, so and that's what he's trying to get at here, is he's bringing out the fact that the psalm begins with Ashrei and ends with Toved. And here this is what he says, das erste Wort. The first word begins with aleph, and the letzte Wort mit tav, the last word with tav, and he calls it an alphabet acrosticon, or an alphabetic acrostic in English, which is determined throughout by the opposition of the two ways, and or the two paths. And so he brought this out, and I thought it was good for us to note that. And he's really the only one who brought out that it's an alphabetic acrostic, and obviously this is shaped in the language and imagery of the wisdom material out of the Old Testament. Okay, so coming here now to the actual psalm itself in Hebrew. What I did is I color coded this so you can see. I know that most of you are not cannot read Hebrew, and that's fine. We will explain it in the following slides better with English. But I wanted you to see here what I did to analyze the psalm strophically, and it's important that we can see. I guess the poetic themes of each section. Now, granted, this is a very difficult psalm to provide a structural analysis or a strophic analysis of each component part. But I think that when you hear the way that I am going to walk you through it, it will make sense this way. So looking at verses 1 and 2, it forms a complete thought. Verse 1, begins with this monocolon, Ashrei ha'ish, oh, happy is the man. And then it goes into a tristic of the degradation of the ungodly way that the righteous man or the happy man does not participate in. So I guess what I did was I titled this first strophe as the do's and don'ts of the happy man, because we are defined, according to verse 1, by what we don't do. And then verse 2 then is descriptive, and it's adversative, it's contrasted. It starts with the word ki'im, but. All right, so it's trying to tell us that happy is the man who has not done such, and such, but his delight is in the law of Yahweh, and in his law he meditates day and night. So that gives the complete thought. It tells you how we're happy from a negative point of view by what we don't do, and then it defines us positively by what we do. And so you really can't separate the complete thought of verse 1 without incorporating 2, because the thought becomes complete, and it's contrasted. So you need to look at that verse 1 is being antithetically set up, so to speak, from verse 2. So we're defined the do's and don'ts of the happy person is going to be looked at by what we don't do and then by what we do. And so I think that's my reason for stating that the first strophe is going to incorporate verses 1 and 2. Then verse 3 can be easily separated out as its own strophe, because now we're looking at a distic and a tristic. And it's a simile, so it's completely offset from verse 1. It's given us a word picture now about the way of the righteous. And then when you come to verse 4, 5, and 6, this is where it's difficult because each verse has its own separate thought. I mean, look at verse 4. It begins with Lochen Hareshaim, but not so the wicked. And then it goes directly into a distic concerning a simile. But he is like the chaff which the wind drives away. And then verse 5, therefore, the Reshaim lo Yakumu Bamishpat, and then it just goes into this next unit about judgment. And forensic judgment by way of inference, therefore, and so it's completely, it's a different thought from the simile in verse 4. So how do we relate these? And then verse 6 is completely separate. It's telling us, the ultimate. I guess the outcome of what happens between the righteous and the wicked. So therefore, I think verses 4, 5, and 6, since the theme is going to center on the wicked, I'm just going to leave this as one large strophe, and it works here. And I just want to say something about the beginning of verse 4. Lo chen hareshaim, not so the wicked. It's a monocolon, as we saw in verse 1 with Ashrei Ha'ish. But you need to see that, you got to see that there's a fulcrum taking place here. At the end of verse 3, there's the last verse set, V'chol asher ya'aseh yatzliach, and all that he does, he shall prosper. That's supposed to, you can actually make a die stick out of that last verse set and the beginning of 4, and not so the wicked, so that it's an antithetical die stick. It would be definitely categorized as antithetical. And this is going to be the hinge by which the whole psalm turns. Verse 4 hinges into the second half of the psalm concerning the disastrous way of the wicked. So either we keep these as a die stick, kol asher ya'aseh yatzliach, line A, and all that he does he shall prosper, and then line B, lo chen hareshaim, not so the wicked, that would be line B. That can definitely be done, and it is being done, I think, poetically here, but to show the that there's two separate thoughts here. Verses 1 through 3, the happy way of the righteous, and then the disastrous way of the wicked. So somewhere you have to make the structural and the structural analysis or the conceptual analysis. There has to be a seam somewhere, but the seam is going to bifurcate here with these two thoughts that end verse 3 and begins with verse 4, and it's a perfect transition of antithetical die stick. It's amazing. Poetically, it works just seamlessly. It's awesome. Okay. We will explain this further as we move on. Okay, so now coming to the psalm itself properly, we'll, in this particular slide, we'll analyze verse 1. I made a structural analysis for here to cover the first half of the psalm, the happy way of the righteous. And that would be descriptive of what's going on in verses 1 through 3. And then you got to look below that. Okay, well, we got the macro structure 1 through 3, the happy way of the righteous. Now, can verses 1 through 3 be broken down into any other type of units? So we, in the last slide, we looked at the strophic level, and we determined that verses 1 and 2 make up a complete, antithetical relationship of the do's and don'ts of the happy life. So verse 1 is going to be talking about the don'ts, the happiness of what one does not participate or what one does not do, an activity that you refrain from. That would be that would identify verse 1, and then verse 2 then would be then we're defined. Our happiness is defined by what we do.
So these are the do's and don'ts of the happy life. And it breaks itself down perfectly into two component parts. And it starts off with the don'ts, and then it goes into the do's for verses 1 and 2. So you need to somehow, when you analyze and make an outline, you need to itemize each component part. And so what you do is you look at the macro structure, and then you look at the microstructure, and you keep going back and forth and back and forth. And when you've defined the beginning and the end of something, then you can have, you need to itemize that. And then you can see, well, are there any other component parts that you can make a subsection on? And so you keep doing this until you arrive at some type of outline, and you're taking into account each unit of thought, and this is what we call structural or conceptual analysis, and that is what I was trained to do. Rolf Knierim was one of my teachers that I've had, and he was at Claremont. He's no longer with us, but anyhow, this is very important that when you come to when we come to a text that we analyze it appropriately, and this is what we're doing here now. And so when we look at verse 1, we already talked about how it begins with this declaration phrase, Ashrei ha'ish, oh, the happiness or how fortunate is the man. So I just went ahead and itemized that as a declaration of Makarism, and that comes from the Greek word makarios, and we call this a Makarism. Scholars do. So I just am following that tradition. Anyhow, so we would itemize the monocolon there, and I did offset that. And when you do that, you have 3 versets. So this is a tristic or a tricolon, and it's set up in such a way that it's degradative, it's devolving, it's true devolution, so to speak, and this is progressively degrading, and the first 2 versets, which would be, who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, and in the way of sinners he has not stood. These are chiastically related to one another in Hebrew. And I put this here in the red section down below, and I bifurcated each verset, who has not walked, and then I halved the verset in the counsel of the wicked, because these are you got the verbal aspect, and then how what is the verb acting on? Is it transitive or intransitive? So here we have it's a transitive verb. You don't walk in the counsel of the wicked, and likewise has stood in the way of sinners. So you have the it begins with who has not walked, and drop all the way down to the bottom, has not stood. So these are offset, and in the middle are the ways or the activities from which to avoid. You're avoiding the counsel of the wicked, and you're avoiding the road of the sinners, or the way of the sinners. And that's important that he artistically, this particular poet who wrote Psalm 1, whoever did, it's done with a lot of thought. This isn't just haphazardly put together. Poetic language is the most difficult language in which to write something in whatever language. But he has this is inspired speech, so God's assisting the author here in how to artistically create this particular wisdom psalm, Torah psalm, of which Psalm 1 is definitely a wisdom psalm. Okay, so if one were to seek the counsel of the wicked, see, if you get counsel, it's going to give you directions in life, and you go to get counsel, and their counsel then is going to lead you to go to do something or go somewhere. So that's what the second verse said. If you were to take the counsel of the wicked, now the word wicked, reshaim, means, if you look at the verbal aspect of rasha in the Hifil, it means to condemn as guilty, forensically. So this when you stand before the judge and you get Hifiled, so to speak, the guilty are condemned. And so the wicked means those who are guilty, those who are condemned. You're a felon. Okay, you've been declared a felon. In court, you have been declared guilty. And so that's what the wicked is. Now, sinner, chata, is it means to miss the mark or to err from the way. So if you take the counsel of those who are condemned, you're going to end up on a road that errs, that misses the mark. So you're gonna end up in a really, really bad place. And that's what this whole psalm is about. So, and then if you were to persist on standing in that road of the people that err, looking at the last verse, because this is all progressive, and it's meant to be progressive. Remember, as what Alter said, disticks or tristichs are structures of intensification. Remember Kugel. Line A is so, what's much more so is line B. And here we have C, what's more is both, it's, line A is introductory, and it's perfect. It's the counsel. So you're getting instructions. You're told where to go. And so you end up on this road of those who err, miss the mark. And then if you stay there long enough, you're going to end up now in the seat of the mockers or the scornful. And that is the worst place to be. You do not want to end up being a mocker or a scorner of God, because then you're calloused. It's hard to reach somebody that's a mocker. They're toast. They have. It's the very, very worst place to be. And if you've ever found yourself there, it's only the grace of God that you're freed from that. But this is definitely progressive, and it's to be more specific, it's devolving. And it's important that you understand that. You got to remember, poetic, the nature of poetry is the relationship of line A with line B, and here we've got three of them. So it's a degradation of people and activities from which to abstain and to avoid. And if you abstain from these and have abstained, then you are fortunate, you are happy, you are blessed, because let me tell you, we are defined by what we don't do. Some people just don't like that type of theology, but I'm sorry, the Bible goes there, and the Bible tells us that we are happy and we are blessed if we do not do certain things. So we are defined by what we do and by what we don't do. And it starts off by what we don't do. And we are declared fortunate or happy. It's very, very important that you see this. Okay, now coming to verses 2 and 3 that I could put on one slide. Let's look at this. We're starting off with verse 2, which is we're ending the very first strophe. So we entitled this, Happiness is Derivative from What One Does Do. So these are the do's and don'ts of happiness. And so when we look at verse 2, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. Okay, so that completes the thought of verses 1 and 2, and they're antithetically related. So here it begins with ki'im, but. So this is adversative. It's meant to be read against what was said previously. And now we're going to get the positive side of how we are defined by what we do. And that is in, so then we see that our delight is in the law of Yahweh. And in his law, he meditates day and night. So that's the distick. So you have to read this as, okay, so what's the relationship of line A with line B? And we're not only looking at what's the relationship of this particular distick of how verse 2 relates to itself, but how verse 2 relates to verse 1. Okay? And that's how you get the first strophe. It's the do's and don'ts of the happy life. So it's very important that you're looking at the bigger picture of what's going on and how these are related. Because once you come to verse 3, it's completely separated. Now you're getting a simile illustration of how the righteous are going to be illustrated as a fruit tree. So it's very easily to separate that. It's the word picture. But now let's analyze verse 2. So, but one's delight is in the law of Yahweh, line A. It's introductory. So that's where one's delight is going to be found. It's not in the counsel of the wicked, but it's in the law of Yahweh. Our delight now is to be in the law of Yahweh. So then what is the second verse that do? What is the structure of intensification? And in his law he meditates day and night. Okay, so you can see here then now line A is introductory, then line B then is now how. Okay, so what does it mean that you delight? How do you delight? Delight is going to be developed by meditating day and night, and after you meditate day and night in the law, that is how you delight in the law. So you'll find out that you may not think that the law of Yahweh is a delight, but if you start meditating in it day and night, 24/7, it becomes your delight. Okay, so this is what the psalmist says, and obviously he's done this not by studying. He's found this out through experience and through how he's lived his life. Now, if you notice here that we have probably an intertextual echo from Joshua 1:8. And it says, this law of the Lord shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night. So the psalmist here is drawing from the book of Joshua and this phrase, and then he's appropriating it and re-signifying it for the needs of this particular psalm. And so it's very obvious, since he's drawing from Joshua, we understand, well, what is exactly the law of Yahweh? Well, this book of the law, this is talking about the Pentateuch, okay? So vis-a-vis intertextuality, or the use of illusion, you can understand that it's talking about the law of Moses. Now, I'm not going to say it has to be limited to that. We can just apply this to all of God's Word. But to be technical here, he's definitely, for those in the know who understand the use of illusion or the intertextual echo, that it goes, he's picking up and he's drawing upon the language of Joshua 1:8. That's very important. The use of intertextuality, that was also a hallmark of the wisdom literature, that it draws from both old and new, and it combines old. You take things out of that are old and new, and you combine them. That's wisdom. Okay. So you're always, what you're doing here is we're looking at the relationship of line A to line B, and then it's a structure of intensification or specification, or the idea is concretized. And so I think by looking at this, verse 2 is perfectly spells itself out. So now when we come to verse 3, this is the simile, and it is a tristic, let me rephrase that. Verse 3 itself is a distic, and he will be like a tree, line A, planted by the channels of water, or the rivers of water. So that's going to be the very first distic, and then you have who makes his fruit in his season, his leaf does not wither, and all that he does shall prosper. So this is a tristic. This is the simile begins with a distic, and it has a tristic. What I did here is I put in verse 4 because I wanted you to see that you can create the very end of verse 3 as a distic with verse 4, and that becomes the fulcrum from which we can then propel ourselves into the second half of the psalm, and that would be the disastrous way of the wicked, verses 4 to 6. Now, I don't want to, I guess I have put them here as a distic, but I really don't. I just want to, it is being done by the psalmist. It's to be read off from one another. But I think it's important that we look at the tristic nature of verse 3 after the first distic. Let's unpack this. So he will be like a tree. Okay, there's line A, planted, or you could say transplanted, upon the channels of water, or the rivers of water. So this is at a place where tributaries, that in a tributary, a river has tributaries where they're feeders. They're feeder creeks that flow into this larger river. And so it's important to understand that the simile here is that the tree is not just planted by the water, but it's at the meeting place of an intersection of two separate waters or channels of waters coming together. So it's getting the benefit of both. So it's the most productive place to be, because if one side doesn't get enough water, the other river does. So it just depends upon the topography of what's uphill from there. And so it's at the most advantageous place to be. because you don't know how long each attributive sublet river is until they join, because one could be miles and miles long. The mountains could be higher on one side, that one particular tributary river is going to have more water flowing than the other. So it's at the most advantageous place. That's important to see. Now, this simile is either the psalmist is drawing on Jeremiah 17 or Jeremiah drew on this. Most scholars are going to look at this as that the book of Psalms, probably in its very last stage of coming together, they would say that it was framed by a wisdom scholars. So they would put this as later than Jeremiah, which would then have this particular psalmist drawing from Jeremiah 17. And I'll follow that tradition here because we don't have a superscription for this particular psalm, whether it's of David or not. So the first two psalms don't have that. But which we do know is that this first psalm has never been attributed to an author within the biblical text itself, within the canon. So therefore we don't, as far as looking at the allusion or the use of it, we'll just take it as late, so that the psalmist is drawing upon Jeremiah 17. So this is another use of intertextuality, and that is a big. You can know that the Bible does this a lot. The use of allusion is very important. And if you look at the context, you should go back and look at Jeremiah 17. You're going to see that this works. This is perfect. This is an awesome use of reusing scripture, recycled scripture. And you'll see the book of Revelation is just one huge, massive kaleidoscope of Johannine mastery of drawing from Ezekiel and Isaiah and the Psalms and the Pentateuch, and it's just Daniel or whatever. It's just it's amazing. That is definitely the most intense book of the use of allusion of any biblical book, for sure. And you'll know that John was his delight was in the law, and he meditated in it day and night. That's obvious by reading the book of Revelation. You'll see it's amazing how it echoes the Old Testament. It's awesome. Okay, so looking at this first distick, he'll be like a tree. Boom, there's your first thought. That's introductory. And then, okay, so what's the relationship of line B? So it's not only just any old tree, it's a tree then that has been planted by the rivers of water. So that's how this intensifies, or it's a structure of more specification, and it gives you a second thought. So remember, as the reader, he's listening, he hears line A, and then he's listening for line B to figure out where this is going. And so now the happy person is being described as a tree that's in the most perfect place that you can be. It's at the adjoining place of where two rivers meet. And then coming to the tristick, and looking at the fruitfulness of the tree, and then how its leaf doesn't wither, and then all that it does, it prospers, or he prospers. Let's look at this. So the next two versets, whose fruit he gives in its season, and its leaf does not wither. I don't know what happened there with Elihu. but there's a typo there in Hebrew. You can hopefully you can overlook that. But his fruit is in his season. He makes his fruit in his season. So it's situated in the most. It's given every advantage for this tree to be fruitful, because it's planted there by the rivers of water. So it's going to be guaranteed that this tree is going to then produce fruit, because it has the necessary water by which to perform that function. And then two, its leaf does not wither, so it's not going to be affected by hot wind or whatever, because its feet is in the water, and it doesn't matter how hot it gets, its leaf is going to remain green, and it's not going to brown up because of the loss of water. It's not planted in an arid place. Even if the weather changes to be very hot, since its feet are in the water, it's having the nutrition of that tree. Remember, Christ is, he's the vine and we are the branches. So as long as we just, we abide in the vine, we're going to produce fruit, and our leaf, is going to be green. So this is what this tristic here is developing a whole thought. So you got the tree, and it's planted in the right place with water, and so it's going to make its fruit, and its leaf doesn't wither. Now this last verse set, the third one, and all that he does, he shall prosper. Now, it leaves the thought of the tree, and now this last verse set is returning to the thought of the person. So the simile is transforming itself back to a person, because it gave the component parts here of this die stick, and then it has, in the last verse set of this tristic, it transforms itself back into the human situation. And it's not, we don't translate this in all that it does, it shall prosper, as speaking of the tree. Now we want to transition here, and all that he does, he shall prosper, to come full circle. And that now we come to the goal of this illustration. It is talking about the prosperous way of the righteous. And then you could see how this last verse set could make a die stick with verse 4, not so the wicked. So we've discussed this already, but it is the hinge here by which to turn into the next half of this psalm, the disastrous way of the wicked.
Now, coming to the latter part, the disastrous way of the wicked. So I have taken not so the wicked. That's going to be a monocolon that is going to form the die stick from verse 1. So blessed is the man, line A, line B is not so the wicked. So even though it's separated, that's the way it's going to, I'm going to read this poetically. And he immediately gives a simile for the wicked, but they are like the chaff which the wind drives away. So as you know, in the ancient world, when they would reap the wheat harvest, they would bring the sheaves to the threshing floor. They would have the donkeys or the ox carry a threshing sledge over all of this, over these sheaves that they cut and brought in, and it would break up the wheat from the chaff and the stem, and then they would take a pitchfork and they would throw it up in the air when the wind picked up, so that the wind would carry away the chaff and the wheat would fall. And this is how this would be the process by which they separated the wheat from the chaff. And so the author here gives us a picture, and since the author belongs to this agricultural society, these word pictures come very simple to him. And the wicked are like the chaff, and they're easily blown away by the wind because they have no weight. And the wheat falls to the ground because the wind can't blow it away because it has weight. Then looking here at verse 5 is the judgment of the wicked. And it says, therefore, the Reshaim shall not arise or shall not stand in judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So there's going to be a condemnation in court and an excommunication from the congregation. So ultimately, that's why, God is in heaven and we're down here. There's no corruption up there. And God's not going to allow corruption into heaven. And there's a separation. And people determine their eternal destinies. And it basically goes like this. If you're a friend of God on the earth, you'll be a friend of God afterlife. Okay? And if God was never your friend in life, don't expect him to invite you to his house after it's all done. Okay? It's just very simple. You need to be a friend of God in life. And most people want to shy away from God because they're guilty. And they don't want, they love their sin a little bit too much. And so they run and they hide from God. And it's very sad. But if people do that continually, I mean, how can you expect to go to heaven after you've shunned God your whole life? You've never been his friend. You've been avoiding him. So I would say to those who may be listening to this particular slide that you need to choose this day whom you're going to serve. And I would say that, just God loves everybody. He's waiting for you. His arms are wide open. And he wants you to turn to him. And look at verse 6. For Yahweh knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked shall perish. Toved. So there you go. Ashrei Toved. You got your alphabetic acrostic. But this is the contrast of the two ways. And this is an antithetical statement. That God knows the way of the righteous, that it will be well. But we already know, but the way of the wicked, we already know it perishes. So, there you have it. It's very simple. That is the mindset by which we are to enter the book of Psalms, vis-a-vis Torah wisdom. And it's always good to examine oneself to see if you're in the faith. Now, for those of you, if you like some of these files or whatever, I can send them to you. Just email me at the email address here. And again, it's all free of charge. This is the gospel is for free. And it's my honor to be able to provide these for the community. And if you've liked it, please say something. If you'd like to add some corrective things, that's fine. I don't know everything. I'm just one scholar here, just trying to, understand my way through life through the Scripture, and I definitely don't think I'm past having doubt. PhD, past having doubt. Hopefully, I'll never ever have that mindset of people that we know with PhDs, even though I do have one. I don't want to be past having doubt. We're always learning, and it's good to stay that way. All right, God bless you. Have a great day.